The cottonwood grove outside Ember Ridge, Montana territory held a silence so profound it felt almost sacred, the kind of hush that settles over the land, vote in the hour before dawn, when even the wind holds its breath. It was late May of 1868, and Lillian Carter knelt in the dirt with iron teeth buried in her flesh. The wolf trap had closed around her left ankle perhaps 3 hours before sunrise, its rust-pitted jaws punching through the worn leather of her boot and into the soft tissue beneath with a violence that had stolen her voice. She had screamed then once, twice, a raw animal sound that tore from her throat and scattered into the darkness. Now she simply breathed in, shallow, careful gasps, her lips pressed tight against the pain that radiated up her leg in waves of white fire. Blood had soaked through her stocking and pooled in the dust beneath her, dark and sticky. Her dress, once a respectable gray wool that had seemed almost elegant in the St. Louis boarding house, was torn at the hem and smeared with mud that had dried into stiff brown patches. Her hands were raw from pulling at the chain, her palms scored with cuts where the iron links had bitten into her skin. She had stopped trying to free herself an hour ago. Now she simply listened, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Men's voices drifted through the underbrush, low and purposeful, punctuated by the metallic jingle of bridle rings and the creak of saddle leather. She could not see them yet through the dense thicket of cottonwood saplings and wild rose, but she could smell them, horse sweat, tobacco smoke, the sharp tang of whiskey on breath carried by the morning breeze. She can't have gone far. One of them called, his voice flat and nasal, devoid of sympathy. Not on foot in the dark, and not with what she stole. The ledger's worth more than she is. Another answered closer, now his tone harder. Dusty wants it back before sunup. The girl too, if she's still breathing. If she's not well, that's one less witness. Lillian pressed her palm against her mouth, stifling a sob that threatened to escape. She had known they would come. She had known it the moment she crawled out of Bartholomew Pike's freight wagon with the leather-bound ledger clutched to her chest, the moment she stumbled blindly into this grove, and felt the trap's jaws slam shut like the hand of an angry, merciless god punishing her audacity. The hoofbeats grew louder, drumming closer through the underbrush like the approach of inevitable judgment. She could hear branches snapping under the horses' hooves, and the low curses of men forcing their mounts through dense vegetation. She closed her eyes and tried to summon a prayer, but the only words that came were a desperate, wordless plea for it to be quick and merciful. She did not want to die slowly. She did not want to face what Pike's men would do before they granted her the mercy of death. Instead, she heard something different, something that did not belong to Pike's rough riders. The soft, deliberate whisper of moccasins on damp leaves. Controlled, purposeful. Not the heavy, careless bootfall of men who believed themselves hunters and her their cornered prey. When she opened her eyes, a tall figure in fringed buckskin was kneeling beside her in the gray pre-dawn light. He was Cheyenne. She knew that immediately, instinctively, from the long, dark hair that fell loose past his shoulders, unbound and unadorned in this moment of urgency, from the way he moved, fluid and silent as smoke, as though the forest itself had parted to allow his passage. His face was angular, weathered by sun and wind, and perhaps 25 years of life on these hard plains, his eyes dark and steady as they assessed her injury with a warrior's practiced calm. His hand settled on her shoulder, firm enough to steady her, but gentle enough not to frighten. She flinched instinctively, expecting violence, for what else had men ever brought her? But his grip only anchored her, holding her still. "Do not move," he said in clear, careful English, his accent slight but present. "You will tear the wound worse if you struggle." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. She did not know if he was her salvation or simply another form of death, perhaps gentler, perhaps not. She knew only that he was wedging the blade of a long hunting knife into the hinge mechanism of the trap, his shoulder muscles bunching under the buckskin as he applied steady, methodical pressure. His other hand remained on her arm, holding her in place, keeping her from jerking away in panic and doing further damage to the mangled flesh of her ankle. Behind the trees, Pike's men crashed closer, their voices rising with the excitement of hunters who believe they have cornered their quarry. "There's fresh blood here, lots of it. She's close, boys. Spread out and check every thicket. I want that book in my hands before the sun clears the ridge." The Cheyenne warrior's gaze flicked toward the sound, sharp and assessing, then returned to her face. He said nothing, but his fingers tightened fractionally on the steel, and the trap groaned under the force of his effort, and the corroded metal protesting, the spring mechanism resisting with the stubbornness of old iron. Lillian bit down hard on her lower lip, tasting blood, and waited suspended between the terror of capture and the fragile, improbable hope of rescue. 10 days earlier, the freight wagon had rolled out of St. Louis on a bright May morning, its canvas cover bleached nearly white by sun and weather, its wooden wheels creaking in a rhythm that had lulled Lillian Carter into something almost resembling hope. She was 19 years old, though the last 3 years had aged her in ways that did not show in a mirror. Those years had been spent working in a textile mill on the St. Louis riverfront, breathing air thick with cotton lint and coal smoke, sleeping on a narrow cot in a room she shared with 6 other girls who coughed through the night and spoke in whispers about consumption and accidents at the looms. The work had been brutal, the pay barely enough to cover her board, and the future, if she stayed, promised nothing but more of the same until her lungs gave out or her fingers were mangled by machinery. When the advertisement had appeared in the boarding house parlor, printed on cream-colored paper, and tacked beside notices for church socials and temperance meetings, she had read it 3 times before she dared to believe what it offered. Respectable husbands sought for virtuous young women. Transportation and proper introduction provided by Prairie Matrimonial Agency. Inquire within for details. She had signed her name on the list before fear could talk her out of it, her handwriting careful and deliberate. The letters forming a promise to herself that there must be something better waiting beyond the smoke and noise of the city. The man who had come to collect them a week later was named Bartholomew Pike, and he had worn gentility like a well-tailored coat. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, his hands soft and uncalloused, his wool coat cut in a style that spoke of eastern cities and comfortable prosperity. He had smiled at each girl in turn, tipping his hat with practiced courtesy, addressing them as Miss, with a warmth that had felt almost genuine. "You'll find honest work and good men waiting out there." He had promised, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "The West is hungry for women like you, strong women, virtuous women, women who can help tame the frontier and build something lasting. You'll have homes of your own husbands who will value your partnership. It's a hard life, I won't lie to you about that, but it's an honest one. A free one." There had been 4 of them in the wagon, Lillian. A shy Czech seamstress named Milena, who spoke halting English and sewed stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. A sharp-eyed woman named Zoya, who had worked in a milliner's shop and kept her opinions carefully guarded behind a facade of pleasant compliance. And Lucinda, a soft-spoken girl who hummed lullabies under her breath whenever the road grew rough or the future seemed uncertain. They had traveled for 9 long days, following the Missouri River north and west into the Montana Territory, watching the land transform around them. The cultivated fields and settlements of Missouri had given way to raw, untamed prairie, vast expanses of grass and sage that stretched to horizons so wide they made Lillian's chest ache with something that felt almost like longing. They had passed crude frontier towns where men stared with open hunger and spat tobacco juice into the dust, where the only substantial buildings were saloons with peeling paint and trading posts with barred windows that suggested violence was more common than commerce. Pike had assured them these were not their destinations. "We're bound for Ember Ridge," he had said, his tone reassuring. "It's a respectable settlement. Churches, a schoolhouse, decent families trying to build something permanent. You'll meet your intended husbands there, homesteaders, mostly good men who need wives to help work their claims and raise families. It's what you signed on for, and it's what you'll get. But 2 nights ago, everything Lillian had believed about her future had shattered like glass dropped on stone. She had woken in the darkness, startled from uneasy sleep, by voices outside the wagon. Low voices, careful voices, the kind men use when they believe their words are private and consequential. She had lain very still, barely breathing, and listened through a tear in the canvas. Pike's voice had come first, smooth and cold, in equal measure. Ember Ridge husbands pay too slowly, Bill. Half of them can barely scrape together the introduction fee before harvest, and I'm not a charity. Sable Junction pays cash, immediately, full price, no haggling. Same marriage contract on paper, just a different sort of arrangement once the ink dries. The second voice had belonged to Dusty Bill Hanley, the lean, hard-faced gunman who rode alongside the wagon as hired protection. You're playing a dangerous game, Pike. If word gets out what you're really doing, if someone talks, no one will talk. Pike had interrupted his tone, dropping to something darker, more threatening. I keep the accounts meticulously clean. Towns see legitimate transport costs, board legal fees. They see marriage introductions and domestic placements. They don't see brothel names or mining camp arrangements because those details are coded. Coded carefully, Bill. And you keep your mouth shut and collect your percentage, or you don't ride with me anymore. Are we clear? There had been a pause, heavy with unspoken threat, before Dusty Bill had grunted agreement. Lillian's blood had turned to ice in her veins. The words had arranged themselves into a pattern she could not deny, a truth so ugly it made her stomach churn with nausea and terror. She had waited until the camp fell silent, until Pike's snores rattled from his bedroll near the dying fire, and Dusty Bill's breathing grew heavy with sleep. Then, moving with the desperate care of someone who understands that discovery means death, she had crawled to Pike's cot and slid the ledger from beneath his rolled blanket. The book had been heavier than she expected, bound in brown leather that was cracked with age, and used its pages filled with neat columns of names and numbers. At first glance, it had looked entirely legitimate expenses for transportation board clothing fees, for marriage introductions, and domestic service contracts. But in the narrow margins, written in tiny, cramped script, were initials and abbreviations that made her heart hammer with understanding and dread. Beside her own name, recorded in Pike's precise hand, she had found the letters S.J., R.L. She had known enough, heard enough whispered conversations in boarding houses and from other mill girls who had older sisters or cousins who had disappeared out west to recognize what Red Lantern meant. It was not a church. It was not a homestead. Sable Junction was a rough mining camp, and the Red Lantern was a brothel where women disappeared into lives of exploitation and violence. She had run. In the darkness, clutching the ledger to her chest like evidence of a crime she had not committed, but would be blamed for discovering she had stumbled through the cottonwood grove. Her boots had slipped on damp leaves, her breath had been loud in her ears, her heart had pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She had not seen the trap, an old wolf snare hidden in the undergrowth, its chain bolted to a stake, driven deep among the gnarled roots of an ancient tree, until the jaws had slammed shut around her ankle with a sound like a gunshot and a pain beyond anything she had ever imagined. She had screamed until her voice gave out, and then she had simply knelt there, trapped and waiting for the inevitable. Now, with a Cheyenne warrior working methodically to free her from the iron teeth that held her, she understood that the trap had been only the beginning of something larger and more dangerous than she could have anticipated. The same dawn, 2 miles north, Cheyenne moved through the pre-dawn shadows with the patient, deliberate rhythm of a man who had learned to read the land's moods before he could read the white man's books. He was 25 years old, a warrior of the Sitsistas, and the people the whites had named Cheyenne in their clumsy attempts to pronounce what could not be translated. His band had been pushed steadily north and east for years. Now, driven by treaties signed in languages his elders did not speak, by soldiers with rifles and cannons, by the relentless westward surge of settlers and railroads that devoured the land like locusts stripping a field. The great war between the white men, the one they called the War of Rebellion, which had consumed their nation and left it scarred and exhausted, had ended only 3 years ago. In its aftermath, the army had turned its attention westward with renewed vigor and surplus weapons, pursuing what they called the Indian problem, with a methodical brutality that had displaced Cheyton's people from hunting grounds their grandparents had known. The bison herds were thinner now, scattered and wary, driven toward the mountains by white hunters who killed for hides and tongues and left the rest to rot under the sun. The old migration patterns had been disrupted by railroads and new fences, telegraph lines, and survey stakes. Starvation had become a real possibility for bands that could not adapt quickly enough. Cheyton did not waste breath cursing what he could not change. He hunted, he scouted, he brought meat to the elders when he could find it, and he traded hides at the few posts that would still accept Cheyenne goods without demanding they surrender their weapons or their dignity. He kept his band alive through skill and determination and a stubborn refusal to accept that survival was impossible. Riding beside him this morning was his cousin Nidus, younger by 2 years, but aged beyond those years by grief and rage. Nidus had watched soldiers burn their winter camp in the brutal cold of January. 2 years past had pulled his mother's body from the ashes of her lodge, had seen his younger sister cut down by rifle fire when she tried to flee into the trees. The memories had carved themselves into his face, had hardened. His voice had made him quick to anger and slow to forgive. He spoke often of revenge, of taking back what had been stolen, of making the whites pay in blood for every acre they had claimed and every life they had destroyed. Cheyton listened, but rarely answered with words. He answered by watching the trails, by reading sign that most men would miss, by keeping his rifle clean and his powder dry, by staying alive when others did not. The whites breed like rabbits and spread like disease, Nidus said as they crossed a low ridge, his voice tight with bitterness. They take our land, kill our bison, steal our sisters and daughters, and we do nothing but watch and die slowly. We survive, Cheyton replied quietly, his eyes scanning the landscape below. Survival is not nothing. It is everything. Nidus spat into the sage. Survival without honor is worse than death. Cheyton did not argue the point. He had learned that words rarely changed minds shaped by loss and pain. Instead, he raised a hand for silence and pointed toward the cottonwood grove in the valley below. Smoke, he said. Camp smoke from last night's fire. Not ours. Not Crow or Arapaho either, unless I miss my guess. White men. They dismounted and moved down the slope on foot, keeping to cover their movements silent and coordinated through years of hunting together. As they drew closer, Cheyton caught scents carried on the morning breeze, horses unwashed, men tobacco, and beneath it all the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood. He heard the voices before he saw the riders, white men armed and searching, calling to one another with the casual brutality of men who believed themselves hunters and their quarry less than human. She's got to be here somewhere. That much blood, she can't have gone far. Check every damn thicket. Cheyton gestured for Nidus to stay with the horses, then moved forward alone through the underbrush, following the scent of blood like a wolf tracking wounded prey. The grove was thick here, the morning mist still clinging to the ground in pale drifting layers that softened the hard edges of reality. That was when he found her. A white woman, young perhaps 19 or 20, with her dress torn and filthy, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears, her left ankle caught in the iron jaws of a wolf trap that had savaged the flesh beneath her boot. A leather-bound book lay in the dirt beside her, its pages crumpled. Her hands were raw and bleeding from pulling uselessly at the chain. For a long moment, Cheyton simply observed his warrior's training, demanding assessment before action. She was clearly fleeing from the men who hunted her. The book must be valuable. Why else would they pursue so determinedly? She was injured badly enough that infection would likely claim her if the men did not find her first. He could leave her, walk away. It was not his fight, not his people's concern. The whites had brought nothing but suffering to the Tsitsistas. But she looked up at him with eyes that held terror and desperate hope in equal measure, and something in those eyes reminded him of his sister, in the moments before the soldiers' bullets had found her that same desperate hope that anyone, might choose mercy over cruelty. He made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. Cheyenne knelt beside her, his hand settling on her shoulder to keep her still, and spoke the only words that mattered in that moment. "Do not move. You will tear the wound worse if you struggle." Then he set to work wedging his knife into the trap's mechanism, knowing that the men hunting her were close, and that he had just chosen a side in a conflict he did not fully understand. The trap had been designed for wolves or coyotes, predators that killed livestock, and therefore had to be eliminated without hesitation or mercy. It was old, the iron corroded with rust, the spring mechanism stiff from exposure to rain and sun and the passage of seasons. The chain was bolted to a stake, driven so deep among the cottonwood roots that Cheyenne knew immediately he could not pull it free. He worked the release mechanism with his knife, using the blade as a lever, applying steady pressure to the hinge, while his other hand remained on Lillian's shoulder, keeping her anchored and still. The steel groaned in protest, the sound loud in the morning quiet. Blood welled fresh from the wound as the pressure shifted, soaking through what remained of her stocking. Lillian pressed her fist against her mouth, her teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached. But she made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. She had learned in the mills, and in the long hours since the trap had claimed her, that screaming accomplished nothing except to waste precious air and draw unwanted attention. The trap opened with a harsh, grinding scrape of corroded metal against corroded metal. Cheyenne slid her ankle free with practiced care, his movements gentle despite the urgency. The jaws dragged across torn flesh and splintered leather, and Lillian's vision swam with black spots that threatened to pull her down into unconsciousness. He caught her before she could pitch forward, his arm solid around her ribs. "Can you stand?" he asked, his English precise, despite the accent that marked it as a learned language rather than a native tongue. "I don't know," Lillian whispered, her voice raw. "Then we discovered together. We must move now. They are very close." He helped her to her feet, or rather to one foot, as her injured ankle could bear no weight at all. She swayed the world, tilting dangerously, and he steadied her with one arm while retrieving the ledger with his free hand. "This is what they hunt for?" he asked, holding up the book. "Yes, it's proof. Proof of what he's doing, selling women like cattle to brothels and mining camps. If they get it back..." She could not finish the sentence. Cheyenne nodded once, understanding immediately the stakes involved. He tucked the ledger into his belt, then arranged Lillian so that her arm draped across his shoulders, taking as much of her weight as possible without jarring the injured joint. "We move slowly and carefully," he said. "If you fall, I will carry you. But speed matters less than silence right now." They moved through the grove in a halting, awkward rhythm, Lillian hopping on one leg, Cheyenne bearing most of her weight, both of them acutely aware of how vulnerable they were. Behind them, the voices of Pike's men grew louder, more excited. "Fresh blood trail here, lots of it. She can't be far. $10 to the man who finds her first." Cheyenne pulled Lillian down behind a massive fallen log, its bark thick with moss and slowly rotting back into the earth. He pressed one hand lightly over her mouth, not roughly, but firmly enough that she understood the necessity. She did not resist. She had already learned that this man moved with purpose, and that questioning his decisions meant wasting precious seconds they did not have. Through gaps in the branches and morning mist, they watched as 3 mounted men passed within yards of their hiding place. One rider, tall and lean, with a drooping mustache, and a scar that ran from his left eye to his jawline, reined his horse to a halt directly across from the log. His hand dropped to the revolver, holstered at his hip, as he scanned the undergrowth, his gaze passing over their hiding place twice. Lillian's heart hammered so violently, she was certain he must hear it. The scarred man sat motionless for what felt like an eternity, his eyes narrowing as he studied the shadows. Then he shrugged, spat a stream of tobacco juice that spattered on the leaves, mere feet from where they hid, and kicked his horse forward with a curse about wasting time on ghosts. Only when the hoofbeats had faded into the distance did Cheyenne remove his hand from Lillian's mouth and rise to a cautious crouch. "We go to Ember Ridge," he said quietly. "To the doctor. That wound must be treated properly, or you will lose the foot, perhaps the leg. Infection is as deadly as a bullet." "They'll follow us there," Lillian whispered, her voice shaking despite her efforts to control it. "Yes," Cheyenne agreed without hesitation. "But in town there are witnesses. Laws, however imperfect. Out here there is only dirt to mark where we fall and die. In town you have a chance. Small, perhaps, but real." He helped her upright again, and together they moved toward the river trail that would lead them to Ember Ridge, the morning sun climbing higher, the shadows shortening around them with each passing minute. In Pike's camp, Bartholomew Pike discovered the theft at first light, and the rage that consumed him was cold and calculating rather than hot and thoughtless. He stood beside his freight wagon, staring at the empty space where his ledger should have been his mind, working through the implications with the speed of a man whose survival had always depended on staying several moves ahead of those who might wish him harm. The ledger was everything. It contained not just records of his current inventory, the 4 girls currently en route to various destinations, but years of carefully coded transactions, contacts at brothels and mining camps across 3 territories, notes on which law enforcement could be bought and for how much. If that book fell into the wrong hands, if someone who understood the codes showed it to a judge or a territorial marshal. He turned to Dusty Bill Hanley, who stood nearby smoking a cigarette, his expression carefully neutral. "Which one?" Pike asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "The Carter girl," Dusty replied. "Gone sometime in the night. Took nothing but the ledger and the clothes on her back." Pike nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "Find her. Take whoever you need. Bring me that book before sunset. The girl, too, if she's still alive. If she's not—" He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished, but its meaning crystal clear. Dusty Bill ground out his cigarette and whistled sharply. Within minutes, 5 men were saddled and armed, checking rifles and revolvers with the practiced efficiency of men who had hunted human prey before. They found blood in the cottonwood grove, dark and plentiful. They found the trap still open, the chain, slick with red. They found boot prints, a woman's small boots, and beside them, the distinctive pattern of Cheyenne moccasins heading north toward the river and the settlement beyond. "She's got help," Dusty muttered, crouching beside the tracks. "Indian by the look of it. Cheyenne, probably. That complicates things." One of the hired guns, a thick-necked man named Cobb with mean pig-like eyes, grinned unpleasantly. "Then we hang 'em both when we catch 'em. 2 for the price of 1. Make it a real lesson about stealing from white men." Dusty said nothing. He simply swung back into his saddle and spurred his horse toward the river ford, his expression grim. He knew that complications meant delays, and delays meant Pike's anger would grow more dangerous with each passing hour. The Powder River ran fast and cold in late May, swollen with snow melt from the distant mountains that rose like teeth against the western sky. The water was the muddy color of weak tea churned and roiled by a current strong enough to sweep a horse off its feet if the rider chose the wrong path across. The ford was passable just barely, but only if one knew where to step, where the gravel bottom offered solid footing and where hidden rocks lurked beneath the surface, like broken bones, waiting to shatter an ankle or trap a hoof. Cheyenne paused at the water's edge, his experienced eyes reading the river's mood. Lillian clung to his arm, her face gray with pain and exhaustion, her injured ankle now swollen to twice its normal size inside what remained of her boot. "Can you swim?" Cheyenne asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "A little." Lillian admitted, her voice tight. "Not well. Certainly not with—" She gestured helplessly at her mangled ankle. "Then you must trust me completely," Cheyenne said, meeting her eyes with an intensity that demanded honesty. "If you panic in the current, we both drown. Do you understand?" Lillian swallowed hard and nodded. "I understand." He had cut a long pole from a riverside willow, a sturdy length of wood he could use to test depth and find stable footing. Now he led her into the water, moving slowly, testing each step before committing his weight. The current pushed hard against their legs, cold enough to steal breath, tugging at Lillian's skirt with insistent, dangerous fingers. They were perhaps a third of the way across when the first shot cracked through the morning air. The bullet struck the water just ahead of them, sending up a geyser of spray that soaked Lillian's face and made her gasp. Cheyenne's response was immediate and unhesitating. He shoved her toward the far bank behind the dubious shelter of a cottonwood trunk that had fallen half into the river during some past flood. Dusty Bill and his men had reached the near bank, their horses blowing hard from a gallop. They were positioned behind rocks and scrub rifles leveled, and their intention was brutally clear. "Girl," Dusty shouted, his voice carrying over the water's rush. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Give me the book and you can walk away from this. You have my word. The word of a man who murders farmers and hunts women." Lillian thought bitterly, but she said nothing. She was pressed flat against the log, her hands shaking, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps that had nothing to do with the cold water and everything to do with naked terror. Cheyenne had his rifle in his hands, a Henry repeating rifle, one of the newer models that could fire 16 shots without reloading a weapon. He had traded 3 prime bison hides for the previous autumn. He returned fire with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed, designed not necessarily to kill, but to keep the hunters pinned down, to make them cautious. "Here," he said, pressing a leather pouch of cartridges into Lillian's trembling hands. "When I tell you open this and pass me bullets, can you do that?" "Yes," Lillian said, forcing her voice steady through sheer will. "Yes, I can do that." Their fingers touched briefly as he handed her the pouch, and something passed between them. In that moment, a recognition perhaps that they were bound together now by necessity and violence, that her survival and his were no longer separate concerns, but a single shared struggle. The exchange of gunfire continued for several minutes, bullets whining across the water, occasionally striking stone with bright sparks or thudding into wood with dull, meaty sounds. Then, one of the shots found a target that made Cheyenne's jaw tighten with controlled fury. His horse, a sturdy mare he had raised from a foal, screamed and went down in the shallows, blood spreading in dark ribbons through the current. Another bullet scored across Cheyenne's upper arm, a burning line that tore through buckskin and skin, though the wound was shallow enough that he barely acknowledged it beyond a sharp intake of breath. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice still calm despite the blood soaking his sleeve. "They will work their way downstream and trap us between the deep water and their rifles. We must move now." He freed his saddlebags from the dead horse, slinging them over his shoulder, then pulled Lillian after him into deeper water. They moved downstream using the current and the cover of the cut bank to put distance between themselves and the gunfire. The cold water rising to their waists, then their chests stealing warmth and breath. By the time they dragged themselves onto the far bank, both were soaked and shivering, Lillian's ankle a swollen mass of torn flesh and forming bruises that made her vision blur with every heartbeat of pain. They followed a cattle trail through scrub juniper and scattered boulders until they reached the homestead of a German farmer named Sven Kruger, a widower who had in years past traded fairly with the Cheyenne and had even learned enough of their language to conduct basic negotiations with respect rather than contempt. Sven opened his door with a shotgun in his gnarled hands, his weathered face wary and suspicious, until he recognized Cheyenne. Then his expression softened fractionally, though his eyes remained cautious. "You bring trouble to my door, Cheyenne," he said in heavily accented English, his tone more resigned than angry. "But I suppose you also bring truth, yes, come. Quickly before they see." He hid them in his hayloft, providing rough woolen blankets and cold cornbread left from breakfast. Lillian collapsed into the straw, her strength finally exhausted, while Cheyenne kept watch through a gap in the boards, his rifle resting across his knees, his dark eyes fixed on the road that led past Kruger's farm. Less than an hour later, Dusty Bill rode past close enough that Lillian could hear the creak of leather, and the metallic jingle of his bridle, could smell the sweat of his horse and the tobacco on his breath when he paused to light a cigarette not 20 yards from where she lay hidden. She held her breath until black spots danced in her vision, until the hoofbeats finally faded into the distance. Then Cheyenne's hand on her shoulder told her it was safe to breathe again. Only then did she realize she was still clutching Pike's ledger against her chest, her knuckles white, her arms cramping from the desperate grip she had maintained through the river crossing and the flight to shelter. Evidence. Proof. The only weapon she had in a war she had never chosen to fight, but could not afford to lose. That evening, darkness granted them the cover they needed to slip into Ember Ridge, a raw frontier town built around a single muddy street, lined with false-fronted buildings that leaned into the prevailing wind, like tired men, too stubborn to fall. There was a saloon with a peeling sign and the tinny sound of an out-of-tune piano drifting through its doors, a general store with barred windows, a blacksmith's forge that still glowed dull red in the gathering dusk, a livery stable. And at the far end of the street, a modest building with a hand-painted sign that read, Dr. H. McCready, physician and surgeon. Cheyenne brought Lillian in through the back door, moving with the silence that had become second nature to him. Hugh McCready, roused from his chair by the soft knock, opened the door with a revolver in one hand and a lamp in the other. "What in blazes?" he began, then stopped mid-sentence when he saw the blood and the exhausted girl half collapsed against the Cheyenne warrior's side. "Wolf trap," Cheyenne said simply, his voice flat with exhaustion. 2 days ago, perhaps 3. The wound is severe." Hugh swore in Gaelic, a long, colorful string of curses that would have scandalized his mother, and cleared his examination table with a sweep of his arm that sent instruments clattering into a tin basin. "Get her up here. Now. Quickly." He was 46 years old. Hugh McCready, a veteran of Antietam and Gettysburg, and a dozen other battles whose names still woke him in the night, soaked in sweat. He had served as a field surgeon in the Union Army, performing amputations in mud-floored tents, while artillery shook the ground and men screamed in languages he could not always identify. After Appomattox, he had come west because the memories made Boston unbearable, and because he thought perhaps on the frontier he might find some kind of peace, or at least escape. He had found neither, but he had found purpose, and that would have to be enough. Now he lit more lamps, flooding his small clinic with harsh yellow light, and went to work with the grim efficiency of a man who had seen too much suffering to waste time on gentleness that served only to make the doctor feel better, not the patient. He cut away Lillian's boot and the remains of her stocking with surgical scissors, peeling back layers of blood-soaked fabric that had dried to the wound. The flesh beneath was torn and swollen, the edges of the lacerations beginning to show the angry red streaks that warned of spreading infection. He swabbed the area with carbolic acid, a new antiseptic technique he had learned from reading British medical journals, and the chemical smell filled the room sharp and medicinal. Lillian shook violently, her hands gripping the edges of the table until her knuckles went white. Her teeth clenched so hard, her jaw ached. She did not scream, but the effort of holding the screams inside left her drenched in cold sweat. Her vision swimming with tears she refused to shed. Cheyenne stood beside her, one hand braced on her shoulder, the other holding her forearm steady when her body tried to jerk away from the pain. "Breathe," he said quietly, his voice close to her ear. "Slow breaths like when you cross a river. You have survived terrible things already. You will survive this." "How? How do you know?" Lillian gasped between waves of agony. "Because you chose to run instead of submit," Cheyenne replied. "Because you are still fighting. That takes a strength that does not break easily." Hugh worked methodically, cleaning out dirt and rust and fragments of leather, debriding dead tissue, applying carbolic-soaked bandages, before wrapping the ankle in clean linen strips with the practiced speed of someone who had bandaged thousands of wounds under much worse conditions. "Keep weight off this for at least 2 weeks," he said when he finished his Irish brogue, thick with exhaustion. "Even then, start slow. If you push too hard too fast, you'll tear it open again and risk gangrene. Best case, you walk with a limp for the rest of your life. Worst case, you lose the foot or the leg. Those are your options, lass. Make peace with them." A woman appeared in the doorway, and then Celestine Avery, the town school teacher, a tall, angular woman of 34, with steel-gray eyes and a spine that looked like it had never bent in submission to anything or anyone. She carried a shotgun cradled competently in her arms and moved with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing chaos. "I heard you had visitors," she said, her Boston accent marking her as decisively Eastern, as Hugh's brogue marked him as Irish. "Are these the kind that require armed escort, Hugh?" "Pike's men are looking for her." Hugh confirmed, washing blood from his hands in a basin. "And probably for him as well." He nodded toward Cheyenne. Celestine's sharp gaze took in Lillian's torn dress, her bandaged ankle, the exhaustion etched into every line of her face, and then shifted to Cheyenne with the assessing look of someone determining threat level and character simultaneously. "Can she walk?" Celestine asked. "Not well and not far," Hugh replied, "but she can manage with a crutch and assistance." "Then she'll stay in the back room of the schoolhouse tonight," Celestine decided. "It's more defensible than you might think, and I'm a decent shot when the situation calls for it." "You," she said, addressing Cheyenne directly, "will need to make yourself scarce in town, but I assume you're capable of that." It was not a question. Cheyenne inclined his head fractionally, acknowledging both the practicality of her assessment and the lack of prejudice in her tone. She was not ordering him away out of racial hatred, but out of tactical necessity, which was rare enough among whites to merit respect. That night, while Lillian slept fitfully on a narrow cot in the schoolhouse back room, and Cheyenne kept watch from a concealed position outside, Hugh and Celestine sat in the clinic by lamplight and opened Pike's ledger with the care usually reserved for diffusing explosives. At first glance, the book appeared entirely legitimate columns of expenses, meticulously recorded names, and dates, transport costs, and service fees. But Hugh had not survived 3 years of war and 5 years on the frontier by taking things at face value. He knew the region, knew the reputations of various towns and establishments. When he saw initials in the margins like S.J., R.L., he did not need a translator to tell him that Sable Junction's Red Lantern was not a church social. When he saw C.F., Coal Face House, he recognized it as the notorious brothel attached to a coal mine where women's lives were measured in months rather than years. What made his blood run cold were the other names scattered among the entries, names that were clearly not white, written in awkward phonetic English: Nahamene Onawa Ayana Talula. Cheyenne names, Sioux names, Arapaho names. Beside one of those names, Nahmeni was a notation that caught his eye. Blue Triangle Belt. 4 Corners, Storm Creek area. Blast and damnation. Hugh muttered, his finger tracing the entry. He's not just trafficking white girls. He's taking native women too, probably promising their families trade goods or claiming he's arranging legitimate marriages to settlers, then selling them into prostitution, just like the others. Celestine's jaw tightened, her hands clenching into fists on the table. We need a judge. We need territorial law enforcement with actual authority and the will to use it. And we need to keep that girl alive long enough to testify, Hugh added grimly. Because Pike won't stop until he gets this ledger back or silences everyone who knows what's in it. He's built his entire operation on the premise that nobody with power will care enough to stop him. If that changes, he loses everything. The next morning, Cheyenne took the ledger to his band's camp near Storm Creek, a half-day's ride north of Ember Ridge, through increasingly rough country that the whites had not yet claimed because the land was too poor for farming and too remote for easy exploitation. The camp was small, perhaps 40 people living in a mixture of traditional hide lodges and makeshift canvas shelters situated along a bend in the creek where the water still ran clear and cold, and the cottonwoods offered shade and privacy. These were the remnants of a larger band that had been scattered by soldiers 2 winters past survivors who had slowly found each other again and clung together because isolation meant death on the plains. Elders gathered around the central fire as Cheyenne laid the ledger before them, explaining what he had learned, what the book represented, what it proved, how it connected to daughters and sisters who had left their bands to marry white men and had never sent word home again. They passed the book hand to hand, studying the columns of numbers and the strange white man's writing they could not fully decipher. But some of the names they knew them well enough that recognition brought tears and sharp intakes of breath. An elder woman named Whitebird, her face carved with the deep lines of 70 hard years, touched one entry with a trembling finger. This was my sister's daughter. She said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nahmeni. She left 3 summers ago to marry a white rancher near 4 Corners. We received one letter written by a missionary saying she was well. After that, nothing. We thought... Her voice broke. We thought perhaps she had forgotten us, or that she was ashamed, or that she had died, and no one thought to tell us because we are only Cheyenne, and our grief does not matter to them. She looked up, her eyes wet. She wore a belt I made for her. White and blue triangles, the pattern my mother taught me. It took me 2 months to beat it properly. Beside her, Nidus, who had been silent until now, his face dark with suppressed fury, spat into the fire. We should kill this Pike, he said flatly. Take his scalp, burn his wagons, leave his body for the crows. That is justice. Not his. He gestured contemptuously at the ledger. Not this paper which white judges will ignore, because they always ignore crimes against us. We know this. We have learned this lesson in blood. Cheyenne met his cousin's eyes steadily. If we kill him without proof that whites will recognize, we become the savages they call us in their newspapers. They will send more soldiers, hunt our band, scatter us again, or kill us all. But this, he tapped the ledger, this is proof even whites cannot easily ignore. Names of their own daughters, their own sisters sold like horses. If we show them what their own people do to each other, some of them, not all, but some, will act. And that gives Whitebird's niece and all the others whose names are in this book a chance. The debate continued for hours, voices rising and falling in Cheyenne, and broken English old arguments about trust and betrayal and survival rehearsed once again because the stakes were always life and death, and there were never easy answers. In the end, The elders agreed to let Cheyenne return to Ember Ridge with a ledger to work with the white doctor and school teacher, who seemed to possess that rare combination of competence and conscience. But the agreement was provisional conditional on results, and Cheyenne understood that if the white man's law failed, as it so often did, there would be a reckoning of a different kind. While they spoke unaware of what was unfolding in the Cheyenne camp, Bartholomew Pike rode into Ember Ridge with a leather satchel full of forged documents and a plan built on years of successfully manipulating frontier law enforcement. Pike went directly to the marshal's office, a squat building with a sagging porch that leaned at an angle suggesting either poor construction or inadequate foundation, or both. Marshal Clayton Byers was 53 years old, tired in ways that went deeper than physical exhaustion, and he had held his position for 7 years, primarily because no one else wanted a job that paid poorly and required navigating the complex, often violent conflicts between settlers, miners, ranchers, and native tribes. He listened as Pike laid out his carefully constructed narrative, his expression neutral, but his eyes calculating the angles, the risks, the potential benefits of choosing one side over another in what was rapidly shaping up to be a very public conflict. "Marshal, I appreciate your time." Pike began, his voice smooth and reasonable, the tone of an educated man, accustomed to being taken seriously by those in authority. "I find myself in an unfortunate situation. One of my clients, a young woman I was transporting under contract to meet her intended husband, has stolen property from me and fled into the wilderness with a Cheyenne male who I can only assume has coerced or threatened her." He spread a sheaf of documents across the marshal's scarred desk: contracts, transport agreements, itemized expense sheets, all bearing signatures, and official-looking seals. "I paid $70 for her passage from St. Louis, Marshal. $70, a considerable sum. I provided food, shelter, safe transportation through dangerous territory. She signed a legal contract agreeing to repay those costs through her marriage settlement. Instead, she has absconded with my private business ledger, a document containing confidential commercial information, and allied herself with a savage who likely intends to use her as a hostage, or worse." Pike's face arranged itself into an expression of wounded dignity and genuine concern. "I simply want my property returned, both the ledger and the girl who is, after all, legally bound to fulfill the terms of her contract. As for the Indian, I leave that to your discretion. But I would strongly suggest that allowing Cheyenne to interfere with legitimate white business sets a dangerous precedent for this territory." He placed a heavy leather purse on the desk, not dramatically, not with obvious intent to bribe, but simply setting it down as though it were a necessary part of the documentation and administrative detail. Marshal Byers studied the contracts. He studied Pike's face. He studied the purse, which clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. He knew Pike's reputation knew it, the way everyone in the territory knew things that were whispered, but never proven, suspected, but never documented. But reputation was not evidence, and the documents in front of him looked legitimate. The girl's signature was clearly visible, shaky but legible beside legal language that certainly seemed to establish debt and obligation. "I'll issue notices," Byers said finally, his voice flat. "Wanted for theft and breach of contract. But if she's gone into Cheyenne territory, that's beyond my jurisdiction. You'll need to take it to the territorial court or request Army assistance." Pike smiled, a thin, controlled expression that did not quite reach his eyes. "I'm confident you'll handle this appropriately, Marshal, for the sake of law and order in Ember Ridge." By midday, wanted notices had been printed and posted throughout town. Wanted Lillian Carter for theft of property and breach of legal contract. Reward offered for her return and the return of stolen business records. Also wanted for questioning unknown Cheyenne male. Approximately 25 years of age, in connection with theft and possible abduction. When Cheyenne returned to Ember Ridge that afternoon, riding slowly through town with the ledger secured in an oilcloth wrapper, he saw the notices and understood immediately that the battle had shifted from physical survival to legal warfare. A battlefield where his people had never been allowed to fight on equal terms. He dismounted in front of the marshal's office with deliberate calm. Within moments, Marshal Byers emerged with 3 armed deputies, their rifles held with the casual readiness of men prepared to use force if circumstances required it. "You need to come with us, Cheyenne." Byers said, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. "We'll sort this out peaceable and legal, or we won't sort it out at all. Your choice how this goes." Before Cheyenne could respond, Lillian emerged from the schoolhouse, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch that Celestine had fashioned from a broken broom handle and leather strips. Her face was pale with pain and exhaustion, but her voice was clear and steady as she called out across the street. "He saved my life," she shouted, drawing the attention of townspeople who had begun to gather, drawn by the spectacle. "Pike is selling women to brothels, not arranging legitimate marriages. That ledger proves it. Every entry, every transaction. Look at the codes in the margins. Ask anyone who knows those establishments what they really are." Pike, who had been watching from the saloon porch, stepped forward with an expression of wounded concern, so perfectly calibrated that it would have been masterful if it were not so utterly false. "Marshal, she's clearly hysterical," he said, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "The poor girl owes me money, a legitimate legal debt, and she's concocted this wild story to avoid her obligations. As for the Cheyenne, he has obviously taken advantage of her vulnerability, perhaps threatened her, certainly influenced her against her own best interests. She doesn't know what she's saying." A crowd had formed now, ranchers and miners, shopkeepers and drifters, prostitutes from the saloon, and respectable wives from the residential section of town, all drawn by the prospect of drama and the possibility of violence. Inside the marshal's office, which had become uncomfortably crowded with Cheyenne, Lillian, Hugh, Celestine, the marshal, 2 deputies, and several onlookers who had pushed their way inside, the argument intensified. "Look at the damned ledger." Hugh insisted, slamming the book down on the marshal's desk hard enough to make papers jump. "Actually look at it, Byers. The codes in the margins. RL means Red Lantern, a brothel in Sable Junction. CF means Coal Face House, a mining camp whorehouse where women die of disease and violence within months. These aren't marriage arrangements, they're sales. Human trafficking." Marshal Byers flipped through the ledger slowly, his weathered face grim. "I see expenses and fees," he said carefully. "I see initials and abbreviations I don't fully understand. But I don't see the word brothel written anywhere in plain English. And without a judge here to interpret commercial codes and contract law, I've got one man's word against another man's word, and one of them has legal documents with signatures." Celestine's mind, sharpened by years of teaching children to think clearly and solve problems methodically, raced through possibilities. She thought about coverture law, the legal doctrine that a married woman's property debts and legal obligations passed to her husband upon marriage. It was a doctrine she had spent years arguing against in suffragist meetings, a law that treated women as property. But now, "Then marry her," Celestine said abruptly, the words emerging before she had fully thought through all the implications. "Right now. If she's married, she's no longer Pike's legal ward or debtor. Her obligations transfer to her husband, and Pike would have to pursue the matter through civil courts rather than simply reclaiming her as though she were a runaway horse. It's not perfect, but it creates a legal barrier." Silence fell over the cramped office, thick and heavy with shock and calculation. Cheyenne, who had remained still and quiet throughout the argument, his face a carefully controlled mask, now turned to look at Lillian with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Your law permits marriage between my people and yours?" he asked Marshal Byers, his English precise, despite the undercurrent of tension in his voice. Byers nodded reluctantly, his expression suggesting he wished the answer were different. There's been talk in the territorial legislature about prohibiting mixed marriages, but nothing's been codified yet. Out here, plenty of folks marry by what we call custom of the country, witnessed agreements that get formalized later when a circuit preacher comes through. As long as both parties consent and there are proper witnesses, it's legally recognized. Chayton's dark eyes shifted to Lillian, and something unspoken passed between them, a question, an offer of recognition of what this would mean in both of their worlds. "This will bind you to me, in the eyes of white law," Chayton said quietly, speaking directly to her, as though the dozen other people in the room had ceased to exist. "On paper, certainly. Perhaps only on paper if that is what you choose when the danger has passed. I offer you a legal shield against that man's claims, not chains to bind you to a life you did not choose. I will claim no more than the law's protection requires. Not unless you ask." Lillian looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since he had knelt beside her in the grove and freed her from the trap. She saw intelligence in his eyes, and honor, and a kind of weary pragmatism that she recognized from her own reflection. He was offering her a choice which was more than Pike had ever done, more than the mill owners had ever done, more than any man in her 19 years had ever offered her. She thought about the trap's iron jaws. She thought about Pike's smooth lies and the names in his ledger names of women who had run out of choices and run out of time. "I'll accept your protection," she said, her voice steady despite the fear and uncertainty churning in her gut. "I'll take the shield." That night in the schoolhouse, with its smell of chalk dust and old paper, with a hastily summoned justice of the peace grumbling about irregular proceedings, they stood before a scattered assembly of witnesses. Chayton had retrieved his war bonnet from his gear, a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers that marked him as a warrior of status within his band. Lillian wore her torn dress cleaned and mended, as well as Celestine could manage her injured ankle wrapped in clean white bandages visible beneath her skirt. The justice of the peace, a farmer named Amos Fletcher, who served as notary and minor magistrate, read through a brief standard ceremony in a voice that suggested he was deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation, but bound by territorial law to perform the service. Celestine and Hugh signed as witnesses, their signatures bold and clear. Then Greyhawk, a Cheyenne elder, who had accompanied Chayton to town out of concern for his safety, stepped forward. He carried a beaded belt, an exquisite piece of craftwork, featuring interlocking white and deep blue triangles that formed a pattern representing rivers and mountains and journeys taken together. The beadwork was intricate, each tiny bead sewn with perfect precision, the design traditional and meaningful. He looped the belt around their joined hands, speaking in Cheyenne, in a low, rhythmic voice that sounded like prayer or invocation, then repeated the essence in halting English. "Two lives walk one trail now. Two sets of eyes watch for danger. Two pairs of hands work toward survival. Honor this or do not. But if you choose to honor it completely." He removed the belt and pressed it into Lillian's hands, his weathered fingers closing her grip around the smooth, worn beadwork. Justice Fletcher concluded the ceremony with bureaucratic efficiency, and suddenly, shockingly, they were married according to the laws of the Montana Territory, and the customs recognized therein. Chayton leaned close, his breath warm against her ear, his voice pitched for her alone. "I will not claim rights I have not earned through your choice," he murmured. "Your decisions remain your own, always." Lillian nodded, unable to speak, past the tightness in her throat. She looked down at the belt in her hands, at the white and blue triangles, the river patterns, the symbol of a shared journey, and felt something shift inside her. Not love, not yet, but the first tentative beginnings of trust, fragile as new ice on a winter creek. Outside, when word reached him, Bartholomew Pike's carefully controlled facade cracked, completely. His hands shook as he poured whiskey into a glass, his mind calculating and recalculating, trying to find an angle. A legal strategy, some way to reclaim control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his ability to manipulate. He had been outmaneuvered by a Cheyenne warrior and a mill girl defeated by a marriage license and a legal technicality, and the humiliation burned worse than any physical wound. He would not accept it. Could not accept it, which meant that legal methods had failed, and it was time to employ the kind of justice that required neither judges nor courtrooms. Only men willing to kill for the right price. The marriage worked precisely as intended. From a legal standpoint, Lillian was now Cheyton's wife. Her debts and obligations transferred Pike's direct claim, severed as cleanly as a knife through rope. But the legal victory ignited a firestorm of social and political consequences that neither Cheyton nor Lillian had fully anticipated. Pike's wounded pride metastasized into cold, calculating rage. He had built his business on control, on understanding that desperate women had no advocates, no resources, no way to fight back against men with money and legal documents. Now, a 19-year-old girl had exposed his operation, and a Cheyenne warrior had outmaneuvered him, using the very legal system Pike had always manipulated to his advantage. The humiliation was intolerable. In the saloon, Pike drank expensive whiskey and spoke in low, urgent tones to men whose livelihoods depended on frontier violence remaining profitable and unpunished. He paid Dusty Bill triple his usual rate and sent him recruiting in the mining camps south of Storm Creek, where desperate men gathered and moral qualms were luxuries no one could afford. Within 2 days, Dusty had assembled a group of hardened killersmen who had fought in the war and discovered they preferred violence to farming drifters with prices on their heads in other territories, miners who had killed claim jumpers and found murder easier than honest work. Pike's instructions were simple: retrieve the ledger, silence the witnesses, make it look like Cheyenne aggression so that Army retaliation would scatter the band, and eliminate any remaining threats. Meanwhile, Marshal Byers, who had accepted Pike's heavy purse and was now trapped between his compromised integrity and his survival instinct, found reasons to obstruct justice. When Celestine sent a telegram to a circuit judge 3 days' ride away, requesting urgent assistance in reviewing potential criminal charges, the marshal received the reply, but filed it away in a drawer, claiming later that the telegraph office must have lost the message. In the Cheyenne camp, the consequences of Cheyton's decision rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Nitus confronted his cousin by the central fire, his voice low and shaking with barely controlled fury. "You married her, a white woman. You tied yourself to the people who burned our lodges, who killed your sister, who are pushing us into smaller and smaller corners of land that was ours for generations. You betray everything we are." Cheyton met his cousin's gaze without flinching. "I tied myself to a legal strategy that protects her from a predator who also preys on our sisters. The ledger proves it. Cheyenne names sold to the same brothels, the same mining camps. This is not about betraying our people. This is about stopping someone who hurts all of us. Their law will not save you." Nitus spat. "Their law has never saved any of us. When they turn on you, and they will turn, cousin, they always turn, you will hang first and she will watch, and then they will kill her too because she knows too much. You have signed your death warrant for a white woman's tears." The words struck deeper than Cheyton wanted to admit, but he kept his expression neutral, controlled. Some of the Cheyenne women turned away. When Lillian walked through the camp, up their faces hard with resentment or grief. Others watched her with cautious curiosity, perhaps remembering sisters and daughters who had vanished into white settlements and never returned, perhaps wondering if this white woman might be different, or might simply be another kind of trap. Lillian felt the weight of those stares like physical pressure. She understood with painful clarity that she had cost Cheyton his standing, his safety, perhaps his life. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, and one night, sitting beside a fire outside the lodge he had designated for her use, She made a desperate offer. "If I go back to Pike," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands twisted together in her lap. "If I tell the judge it was all a mistake, that I panicked and stole the book. But I'm sorry now and willing to fulfill my contract. Maybe he lets this go. Maybe he takes the ledger and leaves you alone, and you can go back to your life." Cheyenne, who had been sharpening his knife on a whetstone with long, deliberate strokes, stopped. The sudden silence was louder than the rasp of steel on stone had been. "He will not stop," Cheyenne said finally, his voice flat and certain. "Not with you. Not with the others whose names fill those pages. Men like Pike do not stop when they are shown mercy. They stop when they are destroyed completely, or when they destroy everything in their path. Those are the only two outcomes possible now." He resumed sharpening the knife, and the rhythmic rasp of stone on steel became the only sound in the darkness, a promise of violence to come deliberate and inevitable. Then Pike struck where the defenses were weakest, and the cost would hurt most. Dusty Bill rode to Sven Kruger's farm at dusk, when the old German was alone in his barn, tending to a lame horse. Dusty walked in, slowly speaking pleasantries about weather and crops, and when Kruger turned his back to fetch a bucket of water, Dusty pulled a knife and drove it into the old man's back twice, once between the shoulder blades, once in the lower back near the kidneys. Kruger collapsed without a sound, beyond a brief, choked gasp. He bled out in the straw, while his 7-year-old son played in the farmhouse yard, unaware. When Cheyenne and Lillian arrived the next morning, warned by a neighbor who had heard the boys screaming, they found Hugh McCready kneeling in blood-splattered straw, his hands red and trembling, his face hollow with helpless grief and rage. Kruger's body lay covered with a horse blanket. His son sat in the farmhouse doorway staring at nothing, his eyes blank and shocked in the way of children who have witnessed horror beyond their capacity to process. "There was nothing I could do," Hugh said, his voice breaking. "He was already gone when I arrived. Bled out in minutes from the back wounds, murder plain and deliberate, not even dressed up as something else." Lillian sat outside the barn later as the sun sank toward the mountains and stained the sky the color of old blood. She held the iron chain from the wolf trap in her hands. Cheyenne had retrieved it for her understanding, somehow, that she needed the physical reminder, the tangible proof of where this had begun. The metal was cold and heavy, and she understood now with brutal clarity that this was not an abstract fight about contracts or legal principles. This was war, and innocent people, good people, who had shown them kindness, were dying simply for being in the way. She looked at the chain, at the blood-dried brown in its links, and made a decision. She would not run. She would not offer herself up as a sacrifice to Pike's wounded pride. She would fight with whatever weapons she had until this was finished, one way or another. Cheyenne sat beside her in the dust, his knife and whetstone in his hands once again. He did not speak. He simply sharpened the blade with long, methodical strokes, the rasp of stone on steel. A steady rhythm in the gathering darkness, and his presence beside her was somehow both comfort and promise. A shared understanding that they were bound together now in a war neither had chosen, but both would fight to the end. The gathering storm broke over Ember Ridge like a summer thunderstorm, turned violent, sudden, destructive, and terrifyingly loud. Pike had spent 2 days moving through the town, like a preacher stoking revival fervor, speaking in low, urgent tones to ranchers and miners, to shopkeepers with daughters and drifters with nothing to lose. He painted vivid pictures of civilization under threat of white women seduced or stolen by savages, of the breakdown of law and order when good men failed to act decisively. "How long will we tolerate this mockery?" he asked in the saloon, his voice rising with carefully calibrated outrage. "A white girl married off to a Cheyenne under some perversion of law. What's next? Will they come for your daughters, your sisters, your wives? Will we wait for judges who never arrive, while savages make sport of our women? The words found fertile ground in fear and prejudice, watered by whiskey and cultivated by Pike's money-changing hands. By nightfall on the third day after the marriage, a mob had formed, perhaps 30 men, maybe more, carrying rifles and torches, their faces flushed with alcohol and righteous anger. Some wanted a trial. Some wanted a lynching. All of them wanted blood. Celestine burst into the schoolhouse, her face pale, her breath coming in gasps. "They're coming," she said urgently. "Right now, armed and organized. The marshal isn't going to stop them. I saw him watching from his office window and doing nothing. You need to run. Both of you. Now." Cheyenne grabbed the satchel containing the ledger and moved with swift efficiency, no wasted motion. He lifted Lillian onto a bay horse that Hugh had saddled and left ready for precisely this contingency. Her injured ankle was carefully positioned in the stirrup, the joint still stiff and painful despite days of relative rest. They bolted out the back of the schoolhouse into darkness. Hugh and Nidus riding close behind, as armed escort in all of them, understanding that separation meant death. Behind them, the mob poured into the street like a flood, breaking through a dam torches, flickering voices rising in a roar of collective rage. Gunfire erupted. The schoolhouse windows shattered glass, exploding inward in bright, deadly fragments. Celestine dropped flat behind her desk, clutching her shotgun, praying silently that she would survive to see morning. Cheyenne led them through narrow back alleys between the livery and the blacksmith's forge, where coals still glowed dull red in the banked fire. Then along the river trail that wound north through brush and scattered boulders. The horses' hooves thundered on hard-packed earth, and their breath loud and labored in the night air. Behind them, the mob surged forward like a living thing, a mass of torchlight and fury. Dusty Bill, riding at the head of Pike's hired killers, knew the terrain with a hunter's intimate knowledge. He had scouted it for weeks, planning for exactly this scenario. He spurred his horse forward, taking a shortcut through a dry wash, racing to reach a choke point where geography would trap their prey. The place was called the Cut Bank, a narrow gap where the trail funneled between a steep rock bluff on one side and a sheer drop to the river on the other. Spanning the gap was a wooden bridge, perhaps 40 feet long, that had been damaged 2 months earlier by spring flooding. The town had begun repairs, but run out of funds and enthusiasm, leaving the structure propped up by temporary timber cribbing and hasty braces that were never meant to bear weight permanently. Local wagoneers knew to cross it slowly, carefully, watching for loose planks and creaking supports. But in the dark, at speed with bullets flying, Dusty Bill and 5 hired guns took positions among the support timbers and stacked cribbing on the near side of the bridge, their rifles ready, hidden in shadow and moonlight. When Cheyenne's group thundered onto the bridge approach, the ambush erupted with devastating suddenness. Muzzle flashes lit the night like lightning. Bullets whined through the air, ricocheting off stone with bright sparks, thudding into wood, with meaty sounds that made Lillian's stomach turn. Nidus's horse went down hard shot through the neck in a spray of arterial blood. Nidus tumbled with the animal, hitting the rocky ground with sickening force, and immediately blood began spreading across his shirt from a wound in his left side. Cheyenne vaulted from his own horse and dragged Nidus behind a low stone wall at the edge of the approach, bullets chipping the rock inches above their heads, stone fragments stinging exposed skin like angry hornets. "Take the book." Nidus gasped, his face twisted with pain, shoving the satchel at Cheyenne with a blood-slick hand. Make them see what he did. Make it mean something. Hugh and Lillian had dismounted and taken cover behind a massive boulder just off the trail. Hugh fired methodically with his old army revolver, each shot carefully aimed despite the chaos, while Lillian gripped the short-barreled pistol he had given her earlier. She had never fired a gun before 3 days ago, and her aim remained wildly unpredictable. but the noise and muzzle flash forced two of the gunmen to dive for cover rather than maintain firing positions. They fought their way forward in desperate bounds, timing their movements between reloads, using the panicked rearing horses as moving shields. Hooves thundered across the bridge, and the old planks groaned ominously under the weight and impact splinters flying where bullets struck wood. Midway across the span, disaster compounded. More riders appeared on the far end, Pike's main mob from town, blocking any hope of escape. Torchlight flickered, illuminating grim faces, twisted with rage and fear. Behind Chayton's group, Dusty Bill and his killers recovered from the initial exchange and charged forward, firing as they came. The gorge dropped away on both sides, and the river snarling 50 feet below, dark and cold and unforgiving. There was nowhere to run, no open ground for maneuver. Only the bridge, the questionable supports and enemies closing from both directions. Chayton swung down from his horse again, using the animal's body for cover, and raised his rifle. He needed to eliminate Pike, the head of the snake, the architect of this violence. If Pike died, the mob might fracture, might lose direction and purpose. But as Chayton drew aim, his mind registered what his eyes had been seeing, but not fully processing the temporary timber cribbing stacked against the damaged section of the bridge, held in place by crude wedges driven into gaps between the support posts. The whole structure was unstable, a half-finished repair job, abandoned by workers who had intended to return in better weather with proper materials. Lillian saw it in the same instant, her mind making connections with the rapid clarity that sometimes emerges in moments of mortal danger. She remembered watching the work crew 3 days earlier when she had passed through town. In the back of Pike's wagon, remembered one worker arguing with another about the wedges being inadequate, about the whole thing being a disaster waiting to happen. She remembered the supervisor dismissing the concerns, saying it would hold until proper funding arrived. And she saw with sudden perfect clarity where Pike stood directly beneath the approach on the cutbank side, shouting orders to his men, positioned precisely where falling timber would strike with devastating force. "The cribbing," she gasped, grabbing Chayton's arm hard enough to leave bruises. "The supports. If we pull the wedges." Their eyes met. Understanding flashed between them, no words needed, no debate, only shared calculation of risk and necessity. Together, staying low to avoid the bullets whining overhead, they scrambled across the planks toward the stacked timbers. The wedges were thick pieces of hardwood, driven deep into the narrow gaps between support posts to hold the temporary cribbing in place. They were never meant to be permanent, and weeks of weight and weather had already begun to compress and weaken them. Chayton gripped the first wedge with both hands, his shoulder muscles bunching as he pulled. The wood resisted, held firm by compression and the massive weight pressing down from above. Lillian braced her good foot against a support post, ignoring the screaming pain from her injured ankle, and added her weight to his effort. Her hands burned splinters driving deep into her palms, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The wedge shifted, just an inch, then another. "Now!" Chayton barked, and they pulled together with everything they had. The wedge came free with a sharp crack like a rifle shot. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The timbers groaned, the bridge shuddered, but everything held. Then physics and gravity asserted their inevitable dominion. The second wedge, now bearing all the weight the first had shared, splintered with a sound like breaking bones. The massive stack of cribbed timbers, each piece weighing hundreds of pounds, shifted, tilted, and toppled off the bridge approach in a cascading avalanche of wood and iron bracing. The leading timbers struck the cutbank where Pike stood with devastating force. Pike saw it coming in the final second, his face transforming from triumph to horror as he tried to throw himself backward. But there was no time, nowhere to go. The first timber caught him across the chest and shoulder, the impact lifting him off his feet and slamming him backward into the rocky slope. More timbers followed in a deadly rain, crushing, smashing, pulverizing. When the cascade stopped, Pike lay at the bottom of the cutbank, his body twisted at angles that no living spine could achieve. Blood spread beneath him in a dark pool that looked black in the moonlight. He tried to draw breath once, twice, a wet rattling sound, and then went still. The river current, patient and indifferent, caught his body and began pulling it slowly downstream toward deeper water and eventual oblivion. The bridge itself shuddered violently, some planks cracking, but the main structure held barely. Pike's hired guns, seeing their employer dead and their promised payment swept away, with his corpse, lowered their rifles slowly. The calculation was simple. No Pike meant no money, and no money meant no reason to die on this bridge tonight. The mob from town, which had surged forward with such collective rage only minutes before now, hesitated, confused their purpose, suddenly uncertain, without Pike's voice to give direction and justify violence. Hugh, seizing the moment with the battlefield instincts he had learned at Antietam, held the blood-stained ledger high above his head, his voice carrying across the gorge with the projection of a man who had once shouted orders over artillery fire. You want to know why she ran? You want to know what this whole damn thing was really about? Here's your proof. Your sisters, your neighbors, your cousins' names are in this book sold to brothels throughout the territory. Coalface House, Red Lantern, Storm Creek, Sable Junction, all of it coded in these margins, all of it documented. Pike wasn't arranging marriages. He was trafficking women, white women, Cheyenne women, any woman he could get his hands on, and selling them like livestock. He slammed the ledger down onto the bridge planks with a sound that echoed across the gorge. Ranchers and miners and townspeople crowded forward, torches held high, squinting at the pages in the flickering light. They saw names, they recognized girls who had left town with promises of new lives and had never sent word home. They saw the coded initials that Hugh and Celestine had already deciphered, and the town names everyone knew were euphemisms for brothels, the sums of money that told a story of commerce in human suffering. The mob's fury, so carefully cultivated by Pike, turned like a weather vane in a storm. Dusty Bill, understanding that the tide had shifted irreversibly against him, tried to bolt for his horse. But a broad-shouldered rancher named Clem, whose niece's name appeared in the ledger, hooked Dusty's ankle with a rifle butt, sending him sprawling face first onto the planks in a spray of blood from his broken nose. Rough hands dragged Dusty to his feet, binding his wrists with the same ropes they had brought to hang Cheyenne and Lillian. The irony was not lost on anyone. The hired guns, reading the situation with the survival instincts of professional killers, dropped their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Whatever Pike had promised them was no longer worth dying for. Dawn came slowly to Ember Ridge, gray and cold, the kind of morning that makes violence from the previous night seem surreal, like a fever dream, that leaves you uncertain what was real and what was nightmare. Soldiers from Fort Ellis arrived by mid-morning, summoned by a telegram Celestine had finally managed to send through a sympathetic operator in a neighboring town who understood that official channels had been compromised. The soldiers were led by a captain named Edwards, a veteran of Sherman's March who had seen enough of war's aftermath to recognize the signs of a massacre narrowly averted. They took Dusty Bill and Pike's surviving associates into military custody, along with the ledger as evidence. The soldiers were methodical and professional, taking statements from witnesses, documenting the scene with the cold efficiency of men accustomed to processing violence. Marshal Byers, pale and sweating his hands, trembling visibly, could not explain away the purse still sitting in his desk drawer or the telegram he had deliberately concealed. Captain Edwards placed him under arrest for corruption and obstruction of justice, and no one in town raised a voice in protest. By afternoon, the immediate crisis had passed, replaced by the slower, harder work of documentation and justice through official channels. But that work would happen without Nidus. Cheyenne's cousin had died before the soldiers arrived, bled out behind the stone wall where he had fallen. His last words a mixture of Cheyenne prayer and curses against the whites who had taken everything from him. He died still angry, still unreconciled, and Chayton carried that weight like a stone in his chest. He prepared his cousin's body according to Cheyenne custom, wrapping him in his best blanket, arranging his weapons beside him. Then he lashed together a travois from lodge poles and rawhide strips, creating a frame to carry Nidus back to Storm Creek for proper burial. Lillian, despite the throbbing, relentless pain in her ankle and Hugh's stern warnings about rest, insisted on walking beside the travois for at least part of the journey. "I brought that ledger out of Pike's wagon," she said quietly when Chayton tried to dissuade her. "I ran, and that set all of this in motion. Nidus died because of choices I made. The least I can do is walk beside him and bear witness to what it cost." Chayton looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. Then we walked together. The journey to Storm Creek took most of 2 days through rough country. Some of the Cheyenne women who had turned away from Lillian before now watched her limp alongside the travois without complaint. And something in their expressions shifted not to acceptance, perhaps, but to a recognition that this white woman understood about paying costs and honoring debts. At Storm Creek, the band received Nidus's body with keening grief and solemn ceremony. They buried him on a hillside, overlooking the creek, his weapons and personal belongings placed beside him. Songs sung in Cheyenne that Lillian did not understand but felt in her bones. Whitebird stood beside the grave and sang a mourning song that made the hair on Lillian's arms stand up, a sound of pure grief that transcended language and culture. In Ember Ridge, Hugh and Celestine began the exhausting work of documenting Pike's network, writing affidavits, coordinating with territorial law enforcement to locate and rescue the women scattered across mining camps and brothels throughout Montana and beyond. Milena, Zoya, and Lucinda were found in different locations, traumatized, wary but alive, and brought back to begin the slow process of healing and deciding what came next. The territorial court opened a formal investigation. Pike's network began unraveling as associates turned on each other, looking to save themselves by providing evidence against others. Justice, slow and imperfect and incomplete, began to move. 6 weeks later, in the Cheyenne camp near Storm Creek, life continued its ancient rhythms despite the trauma and change. Lillian learned to move with a permanent limp, her left ankle forever stiff and prone to aching in cold weather. Hugh had been brutally honest. She would walk with that hitch for the rest of her life, and there was no surgery or medicine that would change it. But she could walk, and after weeks of careful exercise and increasing effort, she could hunt. The Cheyenne women, slowly and with careful reserve, began teaching her practical survival skills. They showed her how to set small snares for rabbits and ground birds, ensuring quick kills without unnecessary suffering. They taught her to tan hides without wasting precious sinew or fur, to read animal tracks to find water in seemingly dry country. The first time her snare killed a rabbit cleanly, Lillian knelt in the grass with the small body in her hands and thought about the wolf trap that had nearly killed her, about iron jaws and steel chains. And she made a silent vow that any trap she set would be as humane as survival allowed. Chayton kept the promise he had made on their wedding night. They maintained separate lodges. Their partnership existed in shared action rather than shared sleeping quarters, hunting together along the rolling prairie, watching each other's backs, when white traders came to the camp, coordinating with Hugh and Celestine to provide testimony for the ongoing legal proceedings against Pike's former associates. One evening in late summer, when the air smelled of sage and approaching autumn, Chayton stood behind Lillian at the river's edge, teaching her how to read the current before attempting a ford. His hands guided hers on a willow pole, showing her how pressure and resistance changed with depth and flow, how to distinguish between solid gravel and treacherous mud. It was purely practical instruction, the kind of knowledge that meant survival in this country. Yet their bodies moved together, with an ease that had been earned through shared danger, through trust built in moments when hesitation meant death. Neither spoke of what was growing between them, but both felt it something patient and real, rooted in respect rather than desperation, built on choice rather than circumstance. Then on a bright morning, when golden light slanted through the cottonwoods and the creek ran clear over smooth stones, Celestine arrived at the camp with someone unexpected, Milena. The Czech woman looked stronger now, no longer skeletal, her eyes clearer, though still marked by what she had endured. She dismounted carefully and approached the fire where the elders sat, her hands twisting nervously together. "I bring news," Milena said in her accented English, which had grown more confident with practice. "Information you might want, from Four Corners where I was, where Pike sent me." Whitebird leaned forward, her weathered face intent. "What news?" "There was a woman there," Milena continued. "Older, maybe 35, Cheyenne. She worked in the kitchen mostly, not with the men like some of us. She spoke English and Cheyenne both. Sometimes late at night when she thought no one listened, she would sing. Sad songs. Songs about home and family." Milena paused, gathering courage. "She told me once when I was sick, and she brought me soup, that she had a brother. That soldiers had burned their camp years ago, scattered their band. She thought he was dead. She said his name was Cheyenne." The silence that fell over the camp was absolute, broken only by the creek's murmur and the distant cry of a hawk. Whitebird stood slowly, her hands shaking. "Did she wear a belt?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "White and blue beads, triangles like rivers." Milena's eyes widened. Yes. Yes, she wore such a belt always, even when... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but everyone understood. Even when the belt was the only thing she wore when clients paid for her time. Whitebird reached out and took Lillian's hand, turning it, so the beaded belt at Lillian's waist caught the morning light, the same belt Greyhawk had presented at the wedding ceremony, the same pattern of white and blue triangles interlocking like rivers flowing together. "This pattern is old." Whitebird said, her voice thick with emotion. "Very old, passed from my grandmother to my mother to me. I made 3 belts in this pattern, one for my daughter who died of fever, one for my sister's daughter Nahmeni, who went to Four Corners and never came home, and one for Nahmeni's brother." She looked at Cheyenne, tears streaming down her weathered face. "For you, Cheyenne, though you were too young to remember receiving it. Your mother gave it to you before the soldiers came." Cheyenne had gone very still, his expression controlled, but his eyes revealing everything: hope and terror and desperate longing warring in equal measure. "My sister," he started, then stopped, his voice failing him. He tried again. "I saw her fall. I saw the soldiers shoot her when she ran for the trees. I pulled her body from the creek where it landed. That was Chana who died." Whitebird said gently. "Your younger sister. But Nahmeni was older, remember? She was already 15 winters working away from the camp that day, gathering firewood in the far grove. She survived the attack, but was found by white men after. They claimed to be taking her to safety to the reservation. But she never arrived there." She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out a scrap of paper, worn and much folded, a letter painfully written in English, with many crossed-out words and awkward phrasing dated 2 years earlier. This came from a missionary woman in Four Corners. She said a Cheyenne woman there had asked her to write to any Cheyenne camps near Storm Creek to say that Nahmeni still lived. The missionary wrote once, only once, and we did not know how to reach back, how to find her, how to bring her home through white man's laws that would call it theft or abduction if we simply took her. Cheyenne took the letter with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the words, seeing his sister's name written there in another's hand, but carrying her voice somehow: "I am alive. Tell my brother if he lives that I remember the river pattern, the belt our mother made, the songs she sang. Lillian watched emotions chase across Chayton's face, grief and rage and hope and determination. And she understood what he would decide before he spoke the words. I must go to Four Corners, he said finally, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. If she still lives, if she can be brought home, I must try. I owe her that. I owe our mother's memory that. He looked at Lillian, and the question in his eyes was clear. Will you let me go alone, or will you walk this trail with me? Lillian thought about the ledger, about Pike's codes and tricks, about how white men with documents and legal language could make captivity look like consent. She thought about her ability to read those documents, to argue in English with sheriffs and judges, to navigate the white world's bureaucracy in ways Chayton could not. You'll need someone who can read every scrap of paper they push at you, she said, her voice steady and certain. Someone who understands how men like Pike hide crimes behind contracts and fees. Someone who won't be fooled by official seals and fancy language. She stood, ignoring the twinge of pain in her ankle, and met his gaze directly. We ride together. Over the next 2 days, they prepared with careful thoroughness. Hugh provided letters of introduction to sympathetic contacts. He knew in Four Corners a doctor, a minister, a shopkeeper who had quietly helped runaway prostitutes before. Celestine copied official court documents naming Chayton and Lillian as protected witnesses in the ongoing Pike investigation papers bearing the territorial seal that might provide some legal shield. Whitebird pressed a small leather pouch into Lillian's hands, her old eyes fierce despite the tears. You bring her home, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. If my sister's daughter still lives, you bring her back to her people. Promise me. I promise, Lillian said, closing her fingers around the pouch. We will do everything in our power. On a clear morning in early autumn, with the prairie grass turning gold and the first hint of frost in the air, Lillian and Chayton led their horses out of the camp and turned south toward Four Corners. The Cheyenne band gathered to watch them leave, elders and warriors, women and children, faces marked by loss and hope in equal measure. Some expressions remained hard, skeptical, unforgiving. Others showed cautious optimism, perhaps wondering if this white woman and this warrior might succeed where others had failed. Chayton wore his war bonnet, the white-tipped eagle feathers catching the morning light. Lillian wore practical traveling clothes and the beaded belt at her waist, and the belt that marked her as his wife, the belt that carried his sister's pattern, and the belt that had become a symbol of journeys taken together and promises kept. Side by side, they rode south into country neither had traveled before, toward an uncertain future, but one they would face together. The trail stretched ahead, winding through grass that rippled like water in the wind. Behind them, the camp grew smaller until it vanished into the landscape. Ahead, somewhere in the distance, Four Corners waited with its secrets and its captives, its corrupt officials, and its hidden suffering. They had faced traps and bullets, ambushes, and mobs, betrayal, and loss. They had learned to trust each other's judgment, to watch each other's backs, to make decisions together that meant the difference between survival and death. Whatever they found in Four Corners, whether Namene still lived, or whether they would carry only news of her death back to Whitebird, they would face it as partners, as equals bound by more than legal documents or forced circumstances. They had chosen this. Chosen each other, chosen this fight, chosen to believe that justice might be possible, even in a world that seemed determined to prove otherwise. The horizon opened before them, vast and blue, and filled with possibility. For the first time since the wolf trap had closed around her ankle in that cottonwood grove, Lillian felt something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. Not naive hope, not the foolish optimism of someone who had never seen cruelty or violence, but the harder, more resilient hope of someone who had survived the worst and discovered she was stronger than she had known, who had found someone willing to fight beside her, rather than abandoning her to face monsters alone. Cheyenne glanced at her as they rode, and something passed between them. Not words, not promises spoken aloud, but an understanding that went deeper than language. They rode together into the golden morning light, two lives on one trail, walking it with the honor that had been earned through fire and blood and choices made when everything hung in the balance. The future was uncertain. The road ahead would be hard, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference.